I guess it started a couple of years ago with the LGBT indoctrination of kids. You can't even turn on a TV these days without child cartoons talking about sex and gender, teaching it in the public schools.
This is Derek Huffman, a 46-year-old American who recently took his family to live in Russia. He claims he was fleeing LGBT propaganda and woke culture. So keen was Huffman to become a Russian citizen, he enlisted in the army.
I defend the country, our new country. I've earned our place here.
He was sure he'd be a correspondent and wouldn't have to fight on the front lines. But after brief training, he was, in fact, sent to the front.
We all know Zelensky is homosexual, and I think that's part of it.
Derek Huffman is just one example. There are more like him who support Russia because of its alleged conservatism. The Kremlin is actively trying to attract conservatives worldwide. It presents Russia as a bastion of traditional family values and portrays Europe as the corrupt West. But is this really true? Is Russia really as conservative as they say in comparison to the morally corrupt West? We can see what's happening in other countries, the moral norms and family institutions pushing entire nations towards extinction and degeneration. But we choose life. Russia has been and remains a stronghold of the traditional values on which human civilization is built. The Kremlin says Russia promotes the traditional model of the family, while the corrupt West and LGBT ideology is destroying it. If that's the case, we shouldn't expect to find families breaking apart in Russia. Let's check. In the US, the divorce rate is around 33 to 42%. In the EU, it's around 38%. But in the self-proclaimed bastion of traditional family values, the figure is as high as 72%.
According to the data from 2024, for every 10 new marriages in Russia, 8 end in divorce. This is a very high level. Even Russian officials mention that Russia is high up in the rankings of countries whose citizens divorce the most frequently. At present, according to the data, Russians are third in the ranking. There are approximately 700,000 divorces annually, and the trend is for more divorces year on year.
I think we are definitely seeing that right now in the West, where there is an absence of traditional values, there's an absence of family values, and Russia is really trying to promote that even on such a high level as this economic forum. And I've even noticed this year that there has been an emphasis on also discussing holy values. There were even priests that were invited to speak.
In Europe, the most common model of the family is based on the traditional union of a man and a woman who want stability and to raise children. For years, this has been different in Russia. 26 million citizens of the USSR died in the Second World War, which led to an enormous disproportion in the number of women and men. The dominant model of the family after the war was thus a complex family, made up of a grandmother, mother, and her children, with no male role model.
Of course, this wasn't a generally accepted norm, but it was a realization of what was really present. That's what it really looked like. So this traditional model of the family often wasn't mom and dad raising kids together. But now the government is trying to enforce precisely this model, that there are parents and their children. But all too often it's not like that, precisely because there are so many divorces. Or also because people are simply choosing not to have kids. It doesn't matter what the Russian state is telling people. The citizens are making their own decisions.
This historical backdrop formed the Russian pragmatism when approaching relationships, which are often treated in utilitarian terms, including financially. This can be seen particularly clearly now, when the state is literally monetizing participation in the war.
My husband got to Africa as part of the PMC Wagner. An ordinary stormtrooper makes 240,000 rubles. It's not much money for me. It took a month and a half from the moment he arrived in Mali until his death. My last conversation with my husband took place a few hours before his death. Then I saw that I got a voice message on WhatsApp. I opened it and it had an avatar with the Wagner PMC emblem. My name is such and such. Piotr is dead. In fact, I also ask myself, what did he die for? Let's be frank, for the sake of money. It's 5 million for the death of a fighter. It's clear that it's not enough for a fun lifestyle. I spent the first month after the funeral in a complete stupor. It's as if I'm not alive anymore. After 40 days, I flew to the Maldives. Why did I leave? It was impossible to stay at home. Too many memories everywhere. I do everything that will help me feel alive. I don't give a damn what anyone is going to say about that. What is most striking is how families are actively seeking out this money. They're ready to send their relatives to the front just to get that money. The Russian media, especially the opposition media, which doesn't need to self-censor when reporting on Russia, often show various stories which lay bare how entrenched this unraveling of society's bonds is, and how bad this fundamental social unit, the family, has become. For example, wives are in conflict with their in-laws, or the mother of a soldier, about who's getting the money. Sometimes women are even willing to get married more than once, so they can get the social benefits for fallen or injured soldiers. Sometimes there are even divorces when a soldier returns home from the front alive, because this is a disappointment. Because, well, he wasn't supposed to come back. Or if a soldier returns with a disability and needs to be looked after. The media reports that there are many of these cases and that it leads to the family becoming dysfunctional, because it turns out that the financial gain was actually the most important thing. In short, he's going to the special operation, and he's leaving everything to me. We're such a happy couple. He gets a signing-on payment of 5 million rubles. Everybody knows about that. And every month he also gets paid. In short, he gets paid 200,000 to 300,000 rubles or more. You can see this is in general a lot of benefits. We can find a kindergarten. We get benefits. Who is he? School benefits, a monthly payment as a wife of a soldier. As a wife of a soldier. That's when we will really start to live. We'll go to the seaside. What do you think? Why are my children going to Abkhazia and to other places? We also gave another girl some money, and she's going to Anapa. And then they'll kill him there. I don't know if I'll buy a house or not. The Russian media reported on extreme cases. There was a nurse working in one of the hospitals treating soldiers returning from the front, and she had multiple marriages with soldiers in a very critical condition, who were in fact dying. She did it precisely to get these payouts. And when the story was broken by some journalists of pro-government volunteers, the nurse was fired. But then there was an avalanche of comments saying that this is not an isolated case, that Russian society has these black widows, meaning women who specialize in getting these benefits for fallen or injured soldiers. Why did I marry him? Well, probably with my plans for the future. That's probably what's holding me back. No, you're wrong. He's resilient, lucky. I can't understand why that is. It's true? Of course, damn it. What are you talking about? With that amount of money, you can go somewhere on vacation. You know, I won't buy a flat or a car, probably, with that money. I'll just go on a vacation to Turkey with that money.
Let's try again. Maybe church attendance is high in Russia. Unfortunately, this theory also fails to hold water. According to research conducted in Russia, 6% of Russians attend church weekly. In the US, this is as high as 21%. In the so-called morally corrupt European Union, it's hard to find a country with a lower figure than in Russia. For example, it's 13% in Spain, 44% in Poland, 8% in France and Germany, and 12% in the UK. So in general, there are not many countries where people go to church less often than in Russia.
Bardzo mało. To kontrastuje z tą polityką państwa.
It's really not a lot. This is in contrast with the state's policy and the propaganda line that Russians form an Orthodox Christian nation, and everyone prays to God in the churches. And the Orthodox Church is put on a pedestal, and you can constantly see it in the media. Russians are simply quite liberal and secular in their views, and they don't feel a deep spiritual connection with the Church. On the contrary, part of society claims it doesn't believe in God at all. If they're asked in surveys if they know the truth of faith or even the principles of how the Church functions, it turns out there's no desire to learn about them.
My main instinct is that the lesson of World War II for some people was white Christian countries are a threat to the world.
100%. Post-war consensus, yes.
And that's just not a fact, actually, at all. It's why they hate Russia.
Yeah.
It's probably going to be the only majority white Christian country in the world soon, and they hate it. That is why they hate it, by the way. Let's just stop lying about it. That's why they hate it.
In a sense, the Russian Orthodox Church can be called a department of the presidential administration, because the Church in Russia is not independent. It's a tool of the executive branch. It dutifully carries out the orders it receives from the Kremlin. It legitimizes its policies in the country and abroad. And it's doing this in exchange for a privileged status among the other faiths in Russia. For these privileges and also for lots of money, which the Kremlin allocates for church activity.
And representatives of the Russian Orthodox Church have repeatedly supported the war in Ukraine and called on Russians to fight. Because if someone is guided by a sense of duty, the requirement to fulfill an oath, that person will remain true to their calling and will fulfill what their duty commands. And if someone dies while fulfilling their duty, then without doubt he has performed an act equal to sacrifice. He has sacrificed himself for others, and that is why we believe that this sacrifice washes a man clean of all his sins. And it is not only individual soldiers who can be absolved of their sins. According to Kirill, the entire country is without sin. We do not want a war with anybody. Russia has never attacked anyone. This is admirable. Such a large and powerful country has never attacked anyone, but only defended itself.
We can say that this organization has taken on a political function, war agitation, the justification of war, creating a kind of metaphysical ideology for this war, which Russia is waging in Ukraine. And in fact, there are priests, with Patriarch Kirill at the forefront, who call this a holy war, saying that Russians are fighting for the existence of their nation there, that they're fighting Satan, that this is precisely an apocalyptic vision of the clash between good and evil, and that those Russians who go to the front will automatically be granted redemption and go to heaven.
I appeal to all the soldiers. Christ was resurrected, and all of us will be resurrected with him and have eternal life. So bravely go to fulfill your duty as soldiers, and remember that if you have given your life for your homeland, for your families, as the Bible says, you will be one with God in his kingdom, in his glory, and in everlasting life.
I też szereg bardzo takich
And there are many of these scandalous statements being made by priests which show they don't respect Russian citizens. One of these statements was made in an Orthodox program where the host asked what can we say to mothers who are scared to send their sons to the front. And an Orthodox priest, who, by the way, shortly afterwards died at the front himself, as he was active in the war, he said that if a woman has more children, then she won't be so upset about just one son going to the front. A friend of my family sold practically everything she had and sent her child to the Canary Islands because she's very worried about her child. And it was impossible to explain everything to her because she said, "He's everything I have. I'll give up anything to make sure my child's there and far away from this situation I don't understand." Do you understand mothers? Do you understand their hearts in these moments?
I understand perfectly well that in the majority of cases the Lord allocated many children to each woman. If a woman fulfilled the holy command, go forth and multiply, if she could forego these artificial means of contraception, then obviously she wouldn't have only one child, but in most cases there'd be many of them, and then it wouldn't be so painful, so terrible to part with one, even if only for a short time. Things are not as bad as they appear. The dominant religion in Russia is Orthodox Christianity. Other faiths have to live in its shadow. The Jehovah's Witnesses are an extreme example of state repression there, but the Catholic Church is also treated with mistrust. No pope has ever been allowed to visit Russia, and Catholics have been accused of expanding their influence. In practice, this sees them pushed out of the public's view. And the Orthodox Church exploits its close relations with the state, amassing a fortune by trading tobacco and alcohol, and even importing Mercedes by officially labeling them as emergency vehicles. Patriarch Kirill himself is far from the model of a good shepherd. There are many photographs of him wearing luxurious clothes and expensive watches.
What does that have to do with who should be a church representative? There have been many different scandals. For example, about apartments owned by the patriarch, which some of his female cousins live in, or whoever, we don't really know. Church residencies, which he uses. All this regularly appears in the public sphere in Russia, and I think that on the level of social perception, it really bothers people and is a huge contrast to what he demands of citizens.
Both the Orthodox Church and the Kremlin refer to the symbols of the USSR, proving that Christian values can go hand in hand with the Soviet tradition.
W przypadku Putina etos czekistowski, powiedziałabym...
With Putin, I'd say the Czechist ethos has many dimensions. First of all, Putin comes from the KGB and was shaped by defined principles, which were instilled in Russian intelligence operatives. For example, the conviction that the West is the eternal and organic enemy of Russia. There's also the belief that the intelligence services, or in general, the repression apparatus, are heroes, the real patriots defending Russia from its external and internal enemies. The people who were shaped by this culture have this phenomenon of romanticizing the Chekists and the repression apparatus. And we've even seen this on numerous occasions in movies sponsored by the state.
This narrative glorifies almost all the creators of the Russian Empire. From General Suvorov, who was responsible for atrocities against Polish insurrectionists in the 18th century, through Felix Dzerzhinsky, whose monument was unveiled again as recently as 2023, all the way to the main character of this mythology, Joseph Stalin.
Things get a bit fuzzy with Stalin. On the one hand, although they don't do it directly and openly, the government praises Stalin as a strong leader who won the Great Patriotic War, who helped the country rapidly develop in industrial terms. On the other hand, Stalin is a kind of PR threat for Putin. In folk wisdom, Stalin is the symbol of the fight with corruption. At least that's how Russians imagine him to have been. And over the last 2 decades, support for Stalin has risen, in part on a wave of criticism of the actions of the Putin regime. So they take a cautious approach here. On the one hand, referring to history to legitimize oppressive and imperial rule. But on the other hand, nothing can eclipse Putin's image as Russia's de facto savior. He's shown as the one who launched the special military operation to prevent Russia's collapse, to stop Russia's enemies destroying it.
And in Putin's Russia, Russia's history is being whitewashed. The Katyn massacre is sometimes relativized, sometimes blamed on the Germans, but it goes even further. Putin has defended Germany's invasion of Poland. This part of the territory had been given to Poland. Where Danzig had been, Gdańsk appeared. Hitler asked Poland to give him the city peacefully, but the Poles refused. They forced him to play hard. They forced Hitler to start the Second World War. Not much is known about Putin's private life, but journalists and investigators have for years pointed to a few women that he's been close to. One of these is Svetlana Krivonogih. According to the independent media outlet Projekt, she'd been working as a cleaner before she met Putin. In 2003, not long after her daughter was born, she bought a luxury flat in Monaco for $4 million. Reports also suggest she acquired shares in a bank and media organizations linked to the government, which features in the broad map of financial connections revealed, for example, in the Pandora Papers. Another person of interest is Alina Kabayeva, a former Olympic gymnast who went on to become a politician and public figure. From around 2006 to 2008, the media claimed she was Putin's partner. Investigative journalists point to a large flat on the Black Sea with a swimming pool, cinema, and heliport. It officially belongs to a close collaborator of the Kremlin, but it's thought that Kabayeva herself uses it. The Russian journalists Roman Badanin and Mikhail Rubin also stated that there are two sons from this relationship, Vladimir and Ivan. One clear example that the Russian elite is not necessarily guided by traditional values is provided by Maria Lvova-belova. This commissioner for children's rights is known and wanted in the West for her role in the kidnapping of Ukrainian children. Her private life reveals a certain paradox of Russian conservatism. She recently remarried. Her first husband is an Orthodox priest, and her new husband is the head of the Orthodox Church's television.
Prawosławie dopuszcza rozwód, więc jakby nie ma może w tym nic.
You can divorce in the Orthodox Church, so there's maybe nothing scandalous about it besides the fact that Maria Lvova-belova herself created her image as a perfect mother in the media and in meetings with Putin. She's also sensitive about her family, which has appeared in the media very often. The new wedding was a huge event. Lots of money was spent on it, with music by famous and very popular Russian stars, such as Valeria and Dima Belan. So now it's Maria Lvova-belova and Konstantin Malofejew, who are the new role models for the Russian family.
Konstantin Malofejew to jest ta nowa, wzorcowa rosyjska para, rosyjska rodzina.
Another very interesting figure is Maria Butina, the Russian TV star who hosts a program about families who fled to Russia in search of conservative values.
A mianowicie deputowana do Dumy
Maria Butina is a member of the Russian parliament, the Duma, and in the US, she was accused of being a Russian agent and was arrested in 2018. She served her sentence in the US and was then deported to Russia. The US accused her of being an agent and a lobbyist. She infiltrated Republican Party circles in the US, including pro-gun rights groups, and tried to lobby in favor of Russia in order to influence political decisions.
tudzież wpływać na decyzje polityczne.
According to the American prosecutor, Butina offered sex in exchange for influence in lobbies.
Ona teraz w Rosji jest taką twarzą właśnie tej konserwatywnej Rosji,
In Russia, she is now the face of Russia's conservative agenda. She appears in a few TV programs in Russia, and one of them promotes family values, traditional religiosity to be exact. I was particularly entertained by one episode about an American, a former soldier, who took his family to Russia. During the show, he spoke to Maria Butina about how happy he was in Russia because there are so many Orthodox churches there. You can always go and pray. He was also happy with the large number of playgrounds because it's hard to find them in the US, but they're everywhere in Russia. So this message is being created in the Russian media. But it's interesting that somebody like Maria Butina has become the face of these programs.
So it's worth asking when Putin became a conservative. We can see a clear pivot in his narrative in 2011. Large-scale protests erupted in Moscow when it was announced that Putin would be running for president again. Many Russians saw that as a manipulation and that it was stripping them of real choice. The regime was scared, and it was then that Putin started to base his politics on the rhetoric of a moral rebirth, of tradition, and the fight with the alleged threats from the West.
Tak zwana liberalizacja miedwiediewowska obudziła pewne nadzieje.
The so-called Medvedev liberalization gave some hope of modernization and liberal reform to the middle class and a part of the whole society. but above all, to some of the political and business elite. And Putin saw that liberalization, or what were in fact only the delusions of a liberalization, were opening up Pandora's box and were a threat to his position in the system. And he decided there would be no liberalization. There would be a conservative turn towards authoritarian rule. It was then that very many repressive laws were introduced. Many freedoms were removed, which had previously been in place. Since then, this authoritarianism and authoritarian rule have only evolved into a dictatorship with what we now see, meaning very clear elements of neo-totalitarianism. We're now also seeing the start of very strong tendencies of referring to history, to selected parts of history, in particular the Great Patriotic War and the rehabilitation of the Soviet apparatus and repression. And this is done to find legitimacy for the increasingly oppressive rule, which is unable to offer citizens any appealing vision of the future.
Russian propagandists also like to talk about drug abuse in the West. What's the situation like in Russia? According to data from October 2024, 11% of Russians claim they know someone who abuses narcotics. This is the highest level since 2018. For 25 to 34-year-olds, this figure is as high as 16%. Official data show that in 2021, 227,000 people were diagnosed with drug addiction, but the real figure is much higher. Around 390,000 Russians use drugs regularly or occasionally. The structure is also changing. There's a fall in users of opioids, but an increase in users of synthetic drugs, psychostimulants, and cannabinoids. The impact of drug addiction in Russia is terrible. In 2020, 18,000 people overdosed and over 7,000 died, which is a 16% increase on the year before.
Co i raz właśnie słyszy się o tym, padają jakieś nazwy, że wynaleziono, czy pojawiły się jakieś nowe narkotyki.
You do hear about this. There is talk that a new narcotic has been discovered, either imported from somewhere in Central Asia or in fact synthesized locally. And this is simply leading to social disintegration, especially in the poorer regions, where young people have no prospects. There are whole generations of simply lost young people. I remember a time when I saw it myself. I was traveling near Lake Baikal and was in a small town. It suddenly started raining and we took shelter in a building, an abandoned school or train station. We went in there in sandals and I simply froze when I looked down and saw a pile of needles by my feet, which had apparently been used by some young people who went there to shoot up. Opposition groups and youth activists, and these groups often overlapped even before the invasion, they would say that the state is not providing enough help to young people struggling with addiction. Some activists are working against the state in this and are sometimes repressed. The best-known case is the mayor of Yekaterinburg, Yevgeny Roizman. He led a whole foundation to help young people with drug addiction. The foundation was crushed. Roizman still resides in Russia, but he's being repressed. For me, this provides an example of how the state authorities fail to make use of the options they have from civil society initiatives to combat drug addiction. The HIV epidemic in Russia is also connected to drug addiction. I don't hesitate to use the word epidemic, and this is another thing the state would prefer not to see. State institutions obstruct the registration of the HIV patients. There is insufficient therapy from the state, and there are more and more HIV cases. But the most absurd thing is that a few years ago, you needed to present an up-to-date HIV test to enter Russia. But in my opinion, the real risk of catching HIV is actually when you're traveling in Russia. If you ask me, the HIV epidemic is the result of these liberal social relations and those, for example, in the family, but also simply at the level of how society functions. This social freedom is widespread, and it's partly also down to the reluctance to use contraception. This is particularly true of men, because it's in contrast to this patriarchal, chauvinist approach to life, that men find contraception uncomfortable and prefer not to use it. And then the whole problem is left to the woman, who may have to deal with an unwanted pregnancy.
And this is one of the most important areas for conservatives: abortion. If Russia is supposed to be such a haven for conservatives, then we should expect the abortion law there to be restrictive. But nothing could be further from the truth. Russia's abortion law is very liberal. Abortion can be given on request with no justification provided until the 12th week of pregnancy. In 2021, there were 12 abortions for every 1,000 pregnancies in Russia. This is much higher than in many countries of the so-called corrupt West.
Aborcja w Rosji jest tradycyjnym prawem człowieka.
Abortion is a traditional human right in Russia. That's how society views it. And the Kremlin is worried about a negative social reaction, and so wouldn't dare change this very liberal abortion law. The law allows a woman up to a certain term to abort the pregnancy on request, and it's even covered by the state social security system. This is a federal law which has supremacy over all other legal acts, according to the philosophy of the law. Having said that, this liberal law has been violated for a few years by informal methods or by passing lower-level or regional laws.
Prawnych niższego rzędu na szczeblu regionów.
Therefore, the role of women here is unique. But at the same time, we all, of course, I mean the male part of the population, we of course all expect a woman to remain attractive, charming, gentle. And in fact, in recent years, at least on paper, there have been fewer abortions in Russia.
Gdy spojrzymy historycznie na to, jaki w społeczeństwie rosyjskim był
If we look at how Russian society viewed abortion historically, data from the late 1950s and 1960s are useful. Back then, abortion was treated as a normal means of birth control in Russia. And according to the data we have, there were 4 to 5 million abortions a year. Today, research and reports prepared by Rosstat and the Ministry of Health state that there are much fewer abortions. But this is partially because the way of counting abortions has become more nuanced. Above all, compared to previous decades, there are fewer abortions. But I think this is because contraception has been widely introduced. At present, there are around 500,000 abortions a year. These are the official data. But we also hear from members of parliament and state officials referencing different estimates. And I think they could also be true, though it's hard to verify these data. They say there could be as many as 1.5 million abortions a year. This is linked to the state policy of aiming to limit the freedom of abortion in Russia. At present, an abortion can be performed on request until the 12th week of pregnancy. Women often do this in public institutions or in private clinics. And over the last 2 decades, various limitations have been introduced. And at present, until the 21st week, there need to be some reasons for an abortion. The methodology of counting them has also changed in recent years about what kind of abortion they are, meaning were they medical abortions or were they performed for medical reasons? For example, when a pregnancy threatens the life of a woman. Or were there other reasons? And often it's difficult to sum up all these cases. And there are also many private clinics, especially in the regions, which perform abortions and very often don't report them. On the one hand, the state wants to increase inspections in these clinics, and many of them have already banned abortions. The Orthodox Church also has an influence. They too carry out inspections or campaign putting pressure on these clinics. Or these reports are simply incomplete. So it's in general difficult to count, without error, how many abortions there are. In part, also because the official data reported by Rosstat and the Ministry of Health doesn't include miscarriages.
Even still, according to the official data alone, Russia has one of the highest numbers of abortions worldwide. We need to point out that recent years have seen the government increasing its attempts to limit access to abortion, but the law is still very liberal.
It's the deliberate strategy of the Kremlin to refer to conservatism. And this boils down to very specific reasons: keeping the regime in power and granting lifetime rule to Putin. These aims need legitimacy, and this is being sought in the quasi-religious, pseudo-conservative narrative, which is supposed to whitewash Russia's objectives and present Russia as a genuine moral civilization in opposition to the morally corrupt West. And it's supposed to show the world that Russia is the Messiah, which once liberated the world from German Nazism and is currently defending the world from the new Nazism. In other words, liberal democracy.
So Russia is keen to talk up its traditional values, but the true picture is different. Marriages fail more often than in the so-called corrupt West. The version of Russian conservatism is all too often nothing more than a show, and not a real defense of the family, of morality, or of society. If you enjoyed this film, why not try one you can see on screen now?